floor, getting to the stage there. That's great.
Not as spry as I used to be. Everybody hear us okay?
Yes, we should check.
I've got kind of a foghorn voice. I barely need this microphone.
That's right. That's right. Well, we're very excited and thankful to the museum and to Jessica for inviting us here, especially for the 100th anniversary of Schulz's life, which is an amazing thing. Someone who touched hundreds of millions of lives around the world, went to space, and this space in particular is a kind of a magical place for me. I don't know for any of you that know, I love to travel around the world and see comic spaces. And for me, this physical museum is on par with some of the best in the world. Whether it's Angoulême in France has a gorgeous 3 or 4 story museum.
Yep.
This one's just as pretty, if not prettier. The Billy Ireland Museum at Ohio State, this one is just as gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
And I have not yet been to the Ghibli Museum. I have not yet been to the Hergé Museum in Belgium. But for those listening at home, if you have the chance to get to this museum at some point in your life, it's a wonderful monument, don't you think, to the power of comics and cartooning?
It really is. For any cartoonist, it kind of makes you catch your breath a little bit.
That one person's hand created this beautiful edifice.
All came from his imagination, and knowing that 50,000 people a year. I was asking earlier, 50,000 people a year come through this place.
Come through this museum.
That's at this. It's in the year 2022. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing that it still has that kind of power.
And I'm sure for people that have already been walking around, you've seen it has such a wonderful international welcome. People from Japan, people from France, people from, I was about to say Canada, like that's some far off land. People from Canada, I'm not kidding, they're coming from Canada.
People from Canada, people from New Jersey. They let them across the bridge.
They're coming all over. So anyway, we are incredibly touched and honored to be here, especially on the 100th anniversary of his life, and what a life to celebrate. And it's the 20th anniversary of this museum, by the way. So, and after this talk, we're going to, of course, have our big walk around as a group, which I hope you'll join us for. But we thank the museum, we thank the staff, we thank Jessica, we thank Jeannie Schulz for the warm and wonderful welcome. And we are excited to be here for this.
Absolutely. And while you're here, don't forget to pick up that 100 objects of Charles Schulz. Make sure you get it. I found this out, by the way. Make sure you get it here from the museum or at the museum shop online. You'll get it signed by Jeannie Schulz. And there's no better way to show your appreciation of the museum than to buy that right here and get it extra special.
It is gorgeous,
make sure you pick that up.
So today we wanted to do kind of a Schulz-focused episode because we're here and because it's the 100th anniversary celebrating his life.
And because they're paying for our hotel.
No, but also, to be quite honest, the 12-year-old version of Brad Geiger and the 12-year-old version of Dave Kellett would be so touched and amazed that we are able to be here because this is a man that put us on the path to cartooning. And I remember very clearly being, and maybe many of you do this too, remember very clearly having the Sunday Funnies spread out on the floor in front of me. We had floor heaters in our house growing up, you know, the kind of like little floor vents, and I would lay over it with a blanket on me and read the Sunday comics, and I would crank up the heat, and my dad would be like, you know how much this costs? And I'd be like, this is so cozy to be with Schulz and so to be here is really a special thing.
It's also particularly cozy to be here with you folks.
So one thing we wanted to talk about was, a couple of things we want to talk about with his life. The art of Schulz and how it would work today, the business of Schulz and how it would work today, and our own start with him as an inspiration. So do you want to get us started on the art of Schulz? And
you want to get us started on the introduction to ComicLab?
Oh my goodness.
I just told them what they're going to do. We got to introduce the show.
I thought that was it. I thought
we got to do our introduction.
Okay.
Now this is the music playing. Ding, ding, ding. Now you start.
I don't have the script.
Welcome to ComicLab, the show about.
That's right. There we go.
We're going into our 5th year.
5 years doing it. All right. I'll say, welcome to ComicLab, everybody. The show about making comics and making a living from comics.
I'm Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this special episode of ComicLab is brought to you by the Charles M. Schulz Museum. So Dave, let's talk comics. I can't believe
that's fantastic.
It was a spontaneous audience uprising.
What spontaneous, beautiful. Amazing, beautiful, and not at all like a 1970s game show. I loved it. All right, so let's talk about the arts, because one of the things that all cartoonists are facing right now, especially of our generation, and I'm saying mainly of Brad and I, but I broadly include all of us here, is that we grew up reading horizontal comics, right? Horizontally oriented comic strips. And we're presented with a world now that reads everything vertical. So it's the vertical scroll on your phone, the vertical scroll on your iPad. And how do you think Schulz would have responded to that had he had to deal with that?
I have a pretty good idea, because all you've got to do is go out into the Charles Schulz Museum. That first little area, they talked about the fact that Peanuts in the beginning was not a raging success. It was a little bit tough. He had a real slow start.
Launched in 7 papers.
Yes. And in order to get this strip going, one of the syndicate salespeople came up with the idea of changing the format. They had to make it smaller so that it could be rearranged horizontally, the vertical scroll,
right,
in a square, we can't speak for Charles Schulz, but I can speak for me. If that would have been me, and I would have grabbed the brass ring after all these years of trying, I'm finally a syndicated newspaper cartoonist, and now the only way to sell my stuff is to make it smaller so they can put it on the classified ad page, not on Pogo, not next to Pogo where it belongs, not next to any other comic. Beetle Bailey was launched around the same time, and didn't have these kind of problems. I would have been humiliated. I would have been upset. I would have been angry. I don't know how he felt. I know how I felt.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what's great about that, though, is that the pragmatic side of him turned it around and made a clear line style, made a reduced word count, made a character that was now, I don't know, 2 heads high, 2.5 heads high. We should talk to Lex from the studio about how many heads high it is. But because if you see some of his earlier stuff, his tall adults are weird. They don't quite work in the way that we're used to.
Yeah.
And so he took what was a limitation and made it shine for him. And I think in that regard, I think he would dive into today's weird challenges and find a way to make it work, don't you think?
The irony there is that smaller size forced him to become more minimalist, forced his writing to become sharper.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
It forced him to be the much better version of himself that he might not have gotten to otherwise, especially if you look at the early Lil Folks versions of the comic. Big difference there.
Yeah.
He had to become a different person. Now, a lot of us are right now, this very minute, bristling against that same format change because the newspaper-style comic strip is on its way out. Because newspapers are on their way out, right? That's undeniable at this point. And that horizontal newspaper strip that's read as one chunk is going. And instead, we're seeing people, especially on webtoons, scrolling through a panel-by-panel presentation of the comic. Whether it's vertical scroll like Webtoons or whether it's a horizontal scroll like Instagram or Reddit, we're seeing a panel-by-panel presentation. And one of the things that makes Charles Schulz super relevant today is that we have to remind ourselves to take the pragmatic approach and to allow this to maybe give us a chance of being a better version of ourselves than we originally thought ourselves to be. Because there's a lot. All you got to do right now and take a look at the innovation that's going on, particularly on Webtoons, and see a lot of people taking that challenge and running with it. And it's a reminder to us to be a little bit more like Schulz and to take something that would have put me by the sidelines, right? If I was in his shoes, I would have been overcome by spite and anger and humiliation. And instead, take that as a challenge and say, I thought it was going to look like this. Now it's going to look like this. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to do that, right?
Yeah, and what's great is that being a filler strip, which I don't know if the phrase that we use that specifically so far, but he was a filler strip at first, which meant much like a television show that doesn't have a fixed place in a schedule, you know, that a first season show that gets moved to Fridays at 8 p.m., now it's Wednesdays at 9:30, and no one knows where to find it. The problem with the filler strip is you never knew where you were going to encounter Schulz's work in the paper. One day it was on fashion, one day it was, like you said, the classified ads.
Classifieds,
And so what's great about that is that maybe to some extent, having that challenge and having those limitations of space in terms of being stackable, cubable, vertical, horizontal, made him a better cartoonist. And in some ways, I think that's happened online with people having to adapt to these weird things on Webtoons, on Instagram, because when you have to say, okay, my comic is eventually going to be in print, right? And so I've got to make it for print. But in the meantime, I've got to make it horizontally scrollable for Instagram, vertically scrollable for what's left of Twitter, and on Webtoons. I didn't get long into the show before I made a Twitter joke. I saved it. What's funny is by the time this show airs, by the way, who knows if Twitter is still around? I don't know. Let's see if Elon can speedrun it and get it gone by then.
$20 says Twitter ain't there.
What's so funny is every time we record an episode, by the way, and we talk about Twitter, it went from like, oh, he's got 2 years before he ruins it. Oh, it's got a year before he ruins it. And now we're like at Christmas or summer, I think, in terms of like, he's really outshining all of our hopes. So anyway, what I was trying to get at, though, is that I think if we're being honest about it as cartoonists and lovers of cartooning, is that the challenges we're facing now are not unlike the ones in the 50s where you have to figure it out, basically, how can my cartooning work in this format, in a vertical format, in a scrollable format, in a slidable format, and then eventually in print. So once you get past sort of the quiet feeling of umbrage of like, darn it, I wish I could just make a horizontal strip like my heroes did. You find that it actually is a nice way to try to have to cartoon, where every panel slides into its own meaning and holds its place until the next one comes in.
Well, just as we wrap up this part of the topic, before we move to the other, you made a great point when we were driving over here about how artists always want no limitations, but it's when you put a limitation on an artist that they shine. You had a great, from the world of painting, you had a great point about that.
About Monet, about how, how essentially, Schulz, towards the end of his life, and we'll talk about this, but how, we all remember the line got shakier, and as natural in a human lifespan. But also how Monet, in losing his eyesight, said, you know what, I'm going to lean into it. My impressionist painting is going to be an impression of what my now limited eyes can see. And if you squint when you look at a Monet, you're like, oh, I see how his blindness informed his painting. And he leaned into it. And by the way, the reason why I mentioned that on Driving with Brad is because when you drive with Brad, you have to distract yourself, or else you're going to be living in terror driving with Brad, which I found out. I'm from Los Angeles, Brad's from Philadelphia, and it was a lot of this kind of hand gripping of the seats. Also, by the way, our rental car, they gave us a Toyota Tacoma 4x4, which is not what you would expect from a rental car, and also not what Brad Geiger should be driving. I was not ready for any of this.
No, neither was I, and the brakes are a little grabby.
A little grabby. You know how you psychologically, you're like, all right, we're coming to a stop. Nope. Like Brad was I don't know what was how he has a squishy foot. So anyway, I was trying to distract myself by talking about Monet and his blindness. Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. But let's switch gears and go into business and talk about Schulz, because one of the things, Brad and I were having a really great conversation last night about how there is sort of a spectrum in the world of cartooning. And on the one hand, you have Watterson, an incredibly limited use of the cartoons, book format, and pretty much that's it.
Not a lot of merchandise.
Not a lot. That's one way to say it.
Just in case you folks don't know, those Calvin stickers you see in the back of pickup trucks, like the one I'm driving, but it doesn't have the sticker, those aren't official merchandise, those Calvin stickers. That's not official.
Right. Like aside from, I think there was one a student publication or a school in like the early 80s that he allowed them to use. Pretty much no other external use, right? And then on the far end of that spectrum, I think we could either put Jim Davis or maybe Walt Disney on the other far end of the spectrum, right? And I think Schulz sort of ended up more towards that end of the spectrum than towards Watterson. But what's interesting is he got heck for it in his own life from other cartoonists.
So if something really interesting happens when cartoonists like us get together and talk about it, we always talk about Jim Davis and with a little sneer or a little snarl about too much merchandising. Schulz never gets that kind of shade from cartoonists. And I got a theory. I think it's because he took his lumps early. So back in the day, Schulz, the merchandising was starting to come. He did an earlier merchandising tie-in, a licensing deal with, I think, Eastman Kodak. He made a small brochure that they put in with the cameras.
Right.
I think the Peanuts date book, which was a big, major milestone, happened a little bit before this. But then Ford Motors Company came calling. They wanted to license Peanut characters for use in animated and print advertising for the Ford Falcon. And one of the sources that I read preparing for this said that mere weeks after he inked that deal, they had a trade organization called something like the National Newspaper Cartoonists Association, something like that.
But it was not the NCS.
It was not the National Cartoonist Society. It was a National Newspaper Comics Artists Association.
Sure, something. Yeah.
Mere weeks after he inked the Ford Falcon, and they had seminars and panel discussions, kind of like we're doing right now. The title of one of those was something to the degree of "How Greedy is Too Greedy," and it was a shot. It was a shot. He took his lumps early, and by the way, again, we can't speak for the person, but I'll tell you exactly how I would have felt about that. I would have harbored it as a grudge.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I think Burke Breathed, I think he said to Watterson, would it be so terrible if a kid wanted to hold a Hobbs, right?
Yeah.
Is that so terrible? And I think in his heart of hearts, he probably no, it's not so terrible. But what I see when I see, like today, we were over in the gift shop at the museum, which is gorgeous, and you should go check it out. Like all of Snoopy's family were there. It was Spike. It was Belle. What were the other ones?
Olaf. Olaf was there,
and I can't remember the fourth one. Muffins. What was that? Does anybody remember the other one? What, marbles? Anyway, I got so legitimately excited seeing them as 3D stuffed animals. Like, to me, what Schulz embraced makes sense. I thought it was a wonderful way to say, if you enjoy the joy of the comics, there's no harm in having a coffee mug that brings you, God forbid, a tiny slice of joy as you're going into work, or a stuffed animal that, God forbid, brings a kid a little bit of joy, or a greeting card. I thought, and maybe this is just the capitalist in me, but I thought that was perfectly fine. I thought it was a lovely way to extend the world and the life and the reach of the comic out where people were living their life, you know?
And that's super important for cartoonists of today who have to be business people, right? We have to be our own business people. We've got to take on that part of it. We really, for the most part, don't have the kind of luxury of sitting back and saying, I'll let my business manager handle that. I'll let the syndicate chief handle that. We have to, and by the way, it's not even have to, because if you hear ComicLab for any amount of time, you know that we love this stuff, right? We embrace it, and in the same way that Schulz did. But
so no, the thing is, I find like as a cartoonist, as a kid, when I was a kid, and when I was reading everything from Bloomhilda to Hagar to Schulz, I got invested in the world, and it took me away from whatever the troubles were as a kid, and still does as an adult, right? And so for me, the idea of a stuffed animal that can make a kid feel okay on a flight that they're nervous about flying to see grandma, right? Yep. There's something wonderful about that. Or again, the greeting card or the coffee mug. So I always thought it was a wonderful way to say comics are powerful, comics change lives, comics can impact lives, and let's bring it out into the world for people to enjoy.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was a wonderful, and frankly, it was a great way for as much as he was able to own and control the business, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, which is something we are a big proponents of for cartoonists for today. But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So young Brad Geiger, reading, what do you think you've brought into your cartooning, or what sparked your cartooning when you were younger?
When I sparked,
from Schulz's work?
There's something that I really go to quite a bit when I took a look at Schulz, and that was his ability to write his own voice. right? He wrote stuff that was his voice. It was a clear voice. You didn't confuse the writing of a Peanuts comic with anybody else.
Right.
It was uniquely his voice, and it takes a long time for a writer to really find their voice. We assume that when we write, it's our voice. But it actually takes a long time to find your voice as a creator, and that's one thing I really was drawn towards. Was he had such a clearly defined voice for himself?
Yeah.
And I thought to that would be really great someday if I could get there to that same point where somebody would say, "Oh, that's definitely a Brad Geiger writing."
Right.
You know,
right.
That's his voice. And if I'm being honest with you, I'm still trying to get there. I think it's going to take another 10 years, but I'm still trying to get there.
Yeah. For me, it's a lot of things. I was always in admiration of that. He chased his dream, he got his dream, and then he stuck with it for decade after decade after decade. And how wonderful to walk that path in life. That's so rare for any of us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And the second thing, and we talked about this last night in the drive too, was how for me as a cartoon writer, as a comic writer, Snoopy, I think, and I'm willing to entertain if anybody has any ideas about this.
Yeah.
Snoopy was the first character that was a pet, was clearly a pet. He got his food from Charlie Brown, from the humans, right? Like he was not of his own character, but he had his own interior life of the mind, his own fantasy world, right? And something about that was different than the Jeep in Popeye.
Right.
It was different than the dog in Bringing Up Father.
The Jeep, all he did was walk around and said Jeep, Jeep.
Looking back on it, the Jeep was a weird character. Yeah. But it was different than what I'm getting at. It was different than so many of the animal characters that you saw in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And so again, I'm willing to entertain that we might be wrong, but I think that Snoopy was the first pet that you saw an interior life, right?
Because Pogo was anthropomorphic. That's a different category, right? And Little Orphan Annie's dog, right? That would be on the other side.
Right.
But Snoopy had an interior life, and I think, and unless somebody can pull something out that proves this wrong, that paved the way for a completely different type of writing that Garfield would take on, Ziggy's parakeet that never got a name.
Calvin and Hobbes would take on. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Calvin and Hobbes, absolutely.
Just a type of writing
about the internal life.
Yeah, that
was never done before Snoopy that I know of.
And we thought for a while. So again, grab us afterward if you can think of one. But so to me, that opened up a whole spectrum of writing that celebrated both the simple, everyday aspect of living, which were all the characters of Peanuts, and then also the vital interior life that they led on their own, whether they were fighting on a Sopwith camel or pretending that they were a famous ice rink champion. An ice rink champion. Boy, you can tell the guy that grew up in Southern California, ice rink champion. I have no idea.
Last night, I swear to God, with God as my witness, this man used the phrase, "Oh yeah, and we have to make sure we see the basketball field."
Yeah, not a sports guy. Not a sports guy.
No, I'm going to throw something out. I'm going to throw a curveball. We didn't plan this. You talked about 12-year-old Brad. What did Peanuts spark in you?
Yeah.
As an older person, what would you say Schulz shows to you today as a maturing cartoonist?
Well, we talked about this when we were walking by the ice rink, because if you haven't gotten a chance to walk over, the ice rink right across the way has the little table that, if not every day, a good many days he would write at. And we were talking about how wonderful it is that from literally marks you make on a page, and you can just get it down to bare bones. That yes, it's words, yes, it's images, but he's making marks on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And that's paying for an ice rink.
Yeah.
That's paying for a cafe that he can go to write in. It's paying for the beautiful studio right across the way here. And so part of it was, as an adult cartoonist, looking at that, I'm thinking to myself, there must have been days in those decades of writing where he's like, I'm done.
Yeah.
I've written every Sopwith camel joke I can, or what else do I have left to give? Because that to me seems the human moments, but the fact that he wrote his way through the hard moments, you know what I mean? Where, for lack of a better phrase, it's kind of writer's block, but also life block, you know? When you've been doing things, imagine him at year 35, you know? And we all assume, oh, it was probably, you know, roses and glasses of wine and how easy to do. It probably got really hard in chunks there, in major life moments when the kids moved out.
Yes.
Or when I don't know, a certain
You're just
employee,
not feeling well.
Yeah, or you're just not feeling well. And he had to carry all of that and the weight of millions of people around the world waiting for it.
Yeah.
That must have been hard, I think, as a cartoonist, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, how would you have faced that as a cartoonist? Quite seriously, how would you have faced that?
Oh, the way I face everything, by hiding from it, by running in the other direction.
Yeah. Anyway, it's quite an accomplishment because I think we think of it as like, oh, how easy it must have been once he reached a certain point. But in some respects, it must have gotten harder as he worked.
Yeah.
Because he had an established world, an established audience, and hundreds of millions of people waiting on him in a way, and yet kept at it. So anyway, before we go on too long, I don't know how much time we have, but do we want to open it up for any questions for folks, do you think?
Yeah, I want to make one real quick point because this is significant. And then you can talk, but I still got more to say. Here's what, as I get older, here's what I see every time I walk through the Charles Schulz Museum, and you see the originals and stuff, and you see a really quivery line that gets quiverier and quiverier as time goes on. He could have had somebody else draw the comic. He could have used a template to draw.
He also could have reused his old art.
He could have done 101 things. You know what he did? He said, you know, I'm getting older. I'm getting, you know, things are changing about my body. I'm coming up against limitations. And I don't know, there's not a single person in this room who hasn't come up against limitations, right? He leaned into that, and all of a sudden, that quivery line wasn't a bug; it was a feature. It wasn't a flaw; it was a mark of beauty. He made that again. It comes back to limitations, I guess. He made that part of what he was doing. He said, basically, yeah, my hand shakes. This is how I draw. Take a good look at it because it is good. And there's something we can all kind of draw strength from in that, because we all do or will deal with those kinds of things in terms of our own personal limitations. Schulz says, lean into it. That's you. Do it and be the best version of that you can be. Wow, does that, as I get older, and as I know I'm going to face more and more limitations, it's kind of a nice thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, joking aside, we all face, you take that word limitation to whatever it has meaning to you in terms of emotional, mental, physical, economic, life standards, whatever it is for you, that it's still possible to make art, and in some ways use that limitation to make better art. And you're right, there is something hugely inspirational about that.
But as we were talking about that, perhaps because he needed to get his mind off of things, let's talk about this just for a second, because I think it needs to be said. Nobody talked about mental health issues the way Schulz talked about, in terms of not only like depression. Who talked about depression before Peanuts in such an elegant and beautiful way? Who talked about taking time for self-care? Things that now we see on social media and on the web left and right all the time, right? Yeah. Nobody in the 50s, nobody was talking about that, right? Nobody was in the 60s either. It was a long time. So we talk about somebody who really was a leader in helping us to embrace our own mental well-being. Schulz is the man in terms of that, who really took the time to almost guide us through this idea of well-being and taking care of yourself. It's really admirable, I think, that he was able to do that in such a sweet and low-key way, in a way that many of us maybe didn't even know that he was doing it. But here he was talking about really serious issues and making it okay to feel a little blue.
Right. Yeah. And frankly, we take it for granted now in comic strips, but in comics in the 20s and 30s and 40s, It was a very different attitude towards it. I mean, I'm thinking, I don't want to name names on comic strips, but alcoholism, abuse were as seen as like the better path. It's like going for the joke in comic strips.
They were treated as punchlines.
They were treated as a punchline, yeah. Whereas Schulz treated it as a human being, and a human being worthy in this moment to feel what they're feeling and to still be loved and to give love. And not to sound smarmy, but that was incredibly special in a comic strip growing up. To feel to see that, and I think that impacted a whole generation of cartoonists for the better, far for the better than what was coming up in the 20s and 30s and 40s. You know.
Well, and also taking a different pathway towards what a comic strip could be. You know, it didn't. Peanuts was kind of neat in the fact that it didn't always end on a boffo punchline. Sometimes it just ended in a sigh, and right. And there's something that's beautiful about that.
Yeah, because he wrote to the completeness of humans.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That not everything is a joke.
Right.
And not everything is a punchline. And that sometimes friendship was enough in that moment.
Yeah.
Sometimes sitting quietly under a tree was enough. You know.
Yeah.
And that was there was.
Sometimes you'll set up a joke for days, and your partner will step on your punchline. And all you can do is look out in the audience and say, sigh.
Touche. I mean, really, it's a testament to one of the things too we were talking about last night. We might as well bring this out.
We talked a lot last night.
We're really talking about Schulz for a long time.
20 years, as you can tell. We've been friends. We've been doing comic conventions for a long time, and we would share hotels, and we'd share tables, and I haven't seen this guy for years because of COVID and so forth. And it's been along with this, it's just been a joy to catch up with my friend. We were talking well into the night last night, so there was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there was. But one of the things that came up, and this may or may not be true, but it seemed appropriate to bring this up to the show now, is that Schulz had memeable moments before there were memeable moments.
Wow.
On the internet.
Yeah.
So you had the psychiatrist is in, you had the kite-eating tree, you had, what I mean is visuals that instantly people would be like, I know where I am, I know what I'm doing, I know what this is. And long before the culture writ large had memes or shared memes or knew what a meme was, frankly. We didn't even know memes were until 20 years ago.
I was pronouncing it Mimi for a long time.
Were you pronouncing it Mimi?
Yeah, Mimi.
It takes a certain bravery to admit that. That's great. But he had those, and what's great is you can, if you wanted to now, snip a certain panel from a Schulz thing, and people would instantly know what that mood is, instantly know what that place is, instantly know what you're trying to communicate. And I think I can't think of another comic strip at that time that had such memeable moments.
And listen, the last Peanuts comic was when? 2000? Check me on that. 2000. 20 years ago, 22 years ago, by my math, we still see somebody referring to Lucy pulling the football away. That's a prime meme.
Yeah.
Right? That's a meme of that it's never going away.
Well, in terms of Shakespeare, they always say introduce 4,000, 5,000 words into the English language.
Right.
But Schulz honestly introduced phrases of security blanket and
fuss budget. Fuss budget was one of his.
Yeah, sort of the reintroduction of sigh as a comment. I know that was a joke before, but so in terms of language, in terms of impact on people, in terms of memeable moments, in terms of cultural impact, and I said it before, but just the idea that Snoopy went to space is awesome for a cartoon and a comic strip, and so. The Eagle has landed was the one that landed on the moon, but wasn't the test one called the Beagle or the Snoopy? Or
I think it was.
I should have looked that up before.
If not, it's a great story.
But just the fact that NASA called him up and said, "Hey, we would like to do this to get kids interested in space." That really speaks not only to the power of comics, but to the power of his specific comics and what he was able to accomplish. So. What does this look? What is it?
Nobody's got a question. Nobody's got a question.
Look at Hurt over here.
Somebody just at least ask David the right way to fold a pocket square. We can talk about that.
Oh my God. So I got to tell you. So Brad calls me up before we fly up. He's like, "Are you going to wear a sport coat?" I go, "No, I'm not wearing a sport coat." And then my wife, she goes, "What are you going to wear?" And I go, "I was going to wear this thing." She goes, "Put on a sport coat." So I'm like, "All right, I'm putting on a sport coat." I arrive. He's like, "You wore a sport coat. What are you doing?" But anyway, inside I had this little pocket square thing, and now I look like I'm on the SS Minnow going like, "Lovey, There's no way I'm gonna.
One wonders what Susan McTaggart would say at a moment like this. One wonders this.
One does wonder because one didn't have anything prepared. So friends, when you're gonna sparkle in the world, sparkle with a little bit of color. Because I'll tell you what, the color you bring to the world is the color you share with the world. That's all I had, friends. I had nothing prepared for Susan McTaggart.
All right.
Well, let's turn it over to a question asker, as Brad likes to say.
Oh, and get nice and close.
Get nice and tight to that mic. So.
This is great. You guys are coming out.
Yeah.
And I was struck, Dave, earlier you had mentioned 35 years into Schultz's career, and he's still going strong.
Right.
And you're also talking, you guys are students of Larson, and obviously I think of Gary Larson and even Berkeley Brother, each of which ended, I think, they're
10 or 15, yeah.
10 years into their run.
Yeah.
They're just retired. Which makes me think Schultz, 10 years in, wouldn't have gotten the flying ace. And I just sort of wonder, like, as cartoonists yourselves, 20 years into your careers, what have we missed something from those guys who retired early? How do you think about just the longevity of creating a comic strip and all the things that we would have missed if Schultz hung up the pen 10 years in?
Right.
Oh, that's a really good point, that calling it specifically at the 10-year mark.
Right.
All the storylines that we might not have gotten to, all the characters we might not have gotten to, including my favorite character, Five. Does anybody know Five? Oh, one hand in the back knows Five. I always reference Five because I think Five is hilarious that Five ever existed as a character in Peanuts. But okay, keep going. So, first of all, thank you for that question. That's a great question. Why don't you tackle that one? Because
give me the hard questions.
No.
No, I'll be honest with you. I think both things can be true. I think somebody like Schultz going the distance for decade after decade and doing amazing stuff can be true. I think it's also okay for something to have a shorter lifespan and to say, this was the beginning, middle, and end. And this is where I choose to end it, and I'm going to go do something else now. I think that can be okay too. I don't think that there's a right or a wrong there. I think both can be good.
Yeah, what I would say is Schultz created a marker that I don't think had existed for many a moon with cartoonists in terms of being able to go for that many decades. And a lot of people, to the benefit of their own mental health, had that marker to hold up and say, I could do what Schultz did, right? Like Watterson could have done, I could have done what Schultz did. Larson could have said, I'm going to do what Schultz did. But because Schultz existed and because he had done the decades, they saw what that life was, And so if we're being generous to the artists that created Bloom County or Far Side or Calvin and Hobbes, they must have looked at that marker and said, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And that's okay, And so I very much respect that question, because who knows what Calvin and Hobbes could have been with another 10 years to it. Mm-hmm. Who knows what Far Side could have become. Who knows what Burke Bradley could have done. Well, he's still kind of doing it now, but in Facebook. But I think there is also a very human thing that we can say is they gave their 10 years and they found in their own heart that it was the most that they could do. So Schultz gave them a gift of holding up a model to say, is this what you'd like to do? No? Okay, that's okay.
Then
which I think is a different way of saying what you exactly said.
That they can both be good.
Yeah. So let's jump in on the next question.
Okay. I'm not sure it's a question, but
Okay.
I just wanted to say something, bring up kind of a warm story about all of this.
Sure.
I'm here with my friend. We met online during the pandemic at the Sequential Artist Workshop, which is a bunch of comics artists that are together from all over the world. And she introduced me to your podcast, which was really terrific. And the thing that's so nice about your podcast, it's so nice. It's really, really kind. It is such a kind place to be.
Wow.
In the world right now. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you guys. And I was thinking about that this morning. She and I checked into an Airbnb in Santa Rosa, and the woman who had the little spot above, the little robin's nest above her garage, walked us out to her car and found out where we were going, and she said, I grew up in Santa Rosa. And I thought everybody knew Charles Schulz. I thought everybody, knew him personally. She said her mother worked at a deli in Santa Rosa. He went there every day and had the same sandwich. And so she said she felt really good about sustaining Charles Schulz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mother did that. And so anyway, I just thought I'd bring that little heartwarming story.
Thank you very much. I like that a lot.
Well, if you don't mind me commenting on that, one of the things that cartooning is wonderful about is that at the end of the day, we're trying to make the world a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so I'm really glad that the kindness of the podcast comes through, because we try to bring that in through as well there, in that we're just artists trying to help other artists in our own flawed and imperfect ways. And cartooning and comics can be such a wonderful place to say, for this moment, for these seconds that you're reading it, you can forget your troubles.
Yep.
and you can be in this world. And we've all had a moment in our life where we really needed that. We needed the escape just for a few minutes to just escape. And so that means a lot to me personally, because we've been able to talk to a few of you before this talk, and some of without saying names, you had a wonderful response that in terms of what it meant to you when people come up and say your cartooning or your podcasting is kind and it makes the world better.
Yeah, it gives you that sense of, if I did nothing else, this one thing makes it all good.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah.
If nothing else happened, that the fact that we reached a person that needed to be reached in that moment is amazing.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
That really does mean the world to us. Thank you. Next question.
Well, that was actually the perfect segue, because my question was related to, how I think a lot of cartoonists want to make a positive change in the world. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I don't know, maybe if sometimes we try too hard, and if we really just need to make the best art that we can, if that's the best that we can do, or if there's anything specific that we can do with our art to help make the world better.
That's before you have a seat again. First of all, thank you. Can you elucidate on what you meant by trying too hard? Because I think I know what you mean, but I want to clarify.
So you just barely said how sometimes it's just enough to brighten someone's day with your comic. I see.
On
the show before too how people have said how, hey, your comic helped me through a dark place in my life. And I think sometimes it's not because you were trying to help anyone through a dark time. You were just trying to be funny, or you were trying to be wholesome.
Right.
And that was enough at that particular time.
I got thoughts.
Yeah, you jump in.
I got thoughts. This is one reason I'm kind of elated to see what's happening with Twitter happen, because I think social media has really screwed a lot of us up, in that if we do a comic and it doesn't get 1,000 likes on Twitter and it doesn't get 1,000 upvotes on Reddit and so on and so forth, we feel like we're a failure. And we've told a lot of people on the show, don't start a Patreon too early. It takes your eye off the ball. Right? Because all of a sudden you're looking, I've only got 1 follower, I've only got 2 followers. And instead of focusing, especially in the beginning, on working on your craft and getting better and finding your voice, like I said, you're focused on whether I got enough hits on Reddit, if I got enough upvotes on Instagram. You know what I'm trying to say. Takes your eye off the ball. And I think there's a lot to be said in that concept of focusing on the kindness and focusing on the craft. That not all of us do a comic that's necessarily kind. There's a place for sarcastic comics. Sure. But focusing on what makes your comic good and not being quite so concerned on whether it's got 100 upvotes today. And that's an okay thing too. And I think seeing, as we've been talking about, and we will be talking about for the next several weeks, as the pendulum perhaps is starting to swing away from social media. It still remains to be seen, but we see some tea leaves happening right now. As we're swinging away from social media, I'm not that upset. Maybe we can all go back to focusing on our craft.
Yeah, it's first. I just want to comment on the idea that nothing has meant more to me in my cartooning than when someone emails and says, "Hey, I was in a really dark place. I was in a bad place in my life," and it's only happened a half dozen of times in my cartooning. But my God, do I hold on to that? That your cartooning made a difference in my life, where you have no idea how tremendously sad I was in this moment, and I just needed to know that I wasn't alone, or I just needed to escape. And that kind of moment means so much to me. So what's great too, and maybe this is what kept Schulz going for 50 years, is that sure, the money's amazing and the money's nice and how lovely, but he touched so many individual lives just by saying, you're not alone. You know, you can be sad in this moment. That's okay. You can be insecure in this moment. That's okay.
And if it's okay, maybe I'll come over and be sad with you.
Yeah. You can sit with me, that kind of thing. Yeah. And so I fail a lot in my cartooning and from what I set out to do, and whether it's make a joke or make a truly heartwarming moment. But it's kind of like that thing of the arc of history bends towards truth. The arc of your career bends towards improving on really reaching your audience. And usually, like Brad said earlier, it's because when you're most honest with yourself and you write from the heart, you really do tend to get people because people recognize the authenticity of it, you know. And so anyway, what I've learned the older I get is that the more I write true to me, the more it oddly touches people that I never thought it would touch, who live and walk very different lives, right, and have very different outlooks on life. And so I do think that younger Dave, I can't speak for you, but younger Dave tried too hard in a way that you said to be, you know, whatever it was, but it came off schmarmy because I wasn't writing to my truth. I wasn't writing true. So yes, to answer your point, I think there is an answer to just writing genuinely, and in so doing, you tend to touch more lives. But anyway, you had a question. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting.
First of all, nice sport coat.
Thank you. Thank you. Although I got to say, I put it on and I a little bit look like a dad at a church group. Like, all right, guys, we're all here. We're doing our thing. You know, I don't sell it well. That's all right.
I'm a dad and I am an elder at my church.
There you go. So there we go. The 1-2 punch. There we go.
Unrelated to that, I want to harken back to something you said earlier, and I'm wondering if it's a generational thing. I don't know if you're familiar with Gordo, Gus Arizola.
Yes. Yeah.
He only wrote Gordo all by himself for 45 years, kind of a slacker.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if it is a generational thing. If folks during that time grew up, you know, came to age in World War II, and there were folks like Little Orphan, they didn't do it for 40 years, but the strip continued. They retired, they died, and the strip continued that way. But I'm wondering if people, those of us young people at 66, are raised on Sesame Street, Bing Bang Boom, if we don't see the long-term commitment that apparently Schulz and Areola and others did see.
You want to take it that, or you want me to take that one?
Yes, I do.
You want me?
Yes, I do. I'll tell you what the difference is that media itself, the media delivery system changed. What the big change between those generations is that those comics were delivered via newspaper, which was a very different animal than the we've got today. The big change there is the media delivery system. You could have a comic that went for 50 years, and again, that doesn't mean that everyone had to, but you could have a lot of those properties that went on for years and years and years, and we see different teams brought in, like, for example, Nancy or Popeye, those comics being done for decades and decades and decades.
Right.
That was a byproduct of the newspaper system because they had that audience right there locked in. They were going to read it over and over and over because they got it in their hometown newspaper. They were, in a certain way, they were a captive audience, okay? We've lost that. We've got a lot more, it's a lot more scattered distribution.
Atomized,
atomized is a great word. Atomized distribution system, and I think that's a contributor as well. I don't know that it's generational, that we have maybe like a shorter attention span or anything like that. I think the big change is the media distribution system as we phase out from newspapers and we phased into internet.
For those listening at home, you missed one of the most amazing bits of hand waving by Brad on that. That was you were doing like Siberian interpretive dance there for a minute. That was great.
I saw those folks do. I think they were doing Tai Chi. I could do that.
Yeah. So my answer to that, because by the way, that's a great question. I think every generation of cartooning and of art in general is a reaction to the previous generation that came before. So in a way, I kind of stand by my answer that because Schulz existed and because his career existed, Watterson and Larson and Johnston and all those had someone to look at and say, I don't necessarily want to do that. In the same way that he looked at Seagar or McManus and said, I don't want somebody else to take over my strip. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So by God, I'm taking this to my grave. I'm going to draw it. You know, and obviously there's some talk about his kids doing it at certain points, but I'm going to take this to my grave. I'm going to die at my drawing desk. Unlike handing it off like McManus did or Seeger or whatever. The cartoonists of the 20s, 30s, 40s. And so I think that's the natural reaction is I don't want mine to become a cog in a corporate creative machine. I want to create it because this means something to me. It's mine. The voice is mine. I want to continue it. And then the generation after that said, yes, that's true.
Yes.
I also don't want to be a corporate, my comic to become a corporate cog, but I also don't want to die at my drawing desk.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end it at 10 years. And then I think, there's various interpretations that are coming in this current generation. But that's, I think, my reaction. What do you think about that?
I'll tell you what I think. I think in every generation, you have to know when, no matter what, you have to know when it's time to say, this has been enough. And this has been enough. You've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living.
Every week he gets me. Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my close personal friend Dave Kellett, the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com, and the creator of the comics documentary Stripped, which if you haven't seen it yet, check out Stripped. It talks about a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about, and it's brilliantly done.
And I don't have the script in front of me, so the music is by Andy Creighton at Andy. You can look for Andy Creighton online. And the show is edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Production. Woodsong Production.
Woodsong Media.
Woodsong Media. Anyway, Matt's great, and we love him. And you should Google Matt's URL that I can't remember right now.
And this show, as always, is brought to you in part by ComicLab's Patreon backers. If you haven't joined us yet, you're missing out on a fantastic community of artists and just a wonderful place. All you got to do is check into the Discord server and see the people helping each other out there. It's a wonderful place. So we encourage you to join us on Patreon. And Dave, there's nothing left for us to do but to thank these nice people.
Thank you all. Thank you all
for
very
showing
much
up today. Thank you so much.
You guys are awesome.
So Dave, let's talk comics. Oh my God, that's going to sound so good. All right.
You know what's amazing about that from a stage to hear that? It sounds like Bob Barker's just like announcing something like, come on down, let's talk comics.